Good morning. This is a joint hearing between House Ways and Means on House Education. It's nice to see you all. I appreciate that we have really fully divided the table here so that everyone knows where everyone stands or sits, as the case may be. We are hearing testimony on the really comprehensive special education report we received. And since we are Ways and Means hosting this, we're hoping to focus on costly education fund, but I imagine we might go in some other directions as the case may be. Like I said, for folks watching and looking, the documents are just being uploaded, will be available in a minute. So Secretary Saunders, if you'd like to join us.
Good morning. Thank you for having us. For the record, I'm Zoe Saunders, I'm Secretary of Education. I am joined by my team to present the findings from our recent current state special education report, along with an overview of our strategic plan and the key initiatives that we have underway. So I'll allow my team to introduce themselves and then we'll get through the slides. So I'll turn it over to Erin Davis first.
Good to see some familiar faces and meet the rest of you. I'm Dr.
There's like a lot of white noise behind this table all the time in this room, so the more you could speak up, the better.
Use my teacher voice. I'm Dr. Erin Davis. I'm the Chief Academic Officer at the agency. Originally from Vermont, graduated from South Burlington High School. I've been in the role for a little over 6 months now. And among the divisions that I lead and support is the Special Education Division. Excited to present to you all today. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ted Gates with the Agency of Education Senior Fiscal Analyst.
Anna Russo, want to go next?
Good morning, all. My name is Anna Russo. I'm the Technical Assistance and Professional Development Manager on the Special Education Division at the Agency of Ed. Lovely to meet you all.
So Anna will be sharing our slides and advancing for us. So thank you, Anna. We'll provide background on the report. This report was a requirement from Act 73, and we want to start by emphasizing the goals for this report were to really evaluate the current state of special education delivery. We took a very proactive approach to this in involving a lot of stakeholders in the review of data and see this as a way for us to meaningfully strengthen the delivery of special education. So our goals for this report are to improve special education delivery and managing the rising costs, ensuring inclusive services in the least restrictive environment in a way that makes efficient and effective use of limited resources while resulting in the best outcomes, responding to the challenges of fully implementing Act 173 and the lessons learned from implementation efforts to date, ensuring that the delivery of special education is responsive to student needs and addressing drivers of growth of extraordinary expenditures in special education. We'll provide a little background on how this report came together. We conducted an extensive review of all data, and we also brought in practitioners from across the state of Vermont to work with us in evaluating the current conditions, evaluating the barriers and success factors as we look at special education delivery across the state. And we continue to be involved with practitioners in really moving our work forward. I want to really recognize and appreciate all of those that participated on the steering committee. So I'll allow, if we can advance to the next slide to talk about the steering committees, I will allow Erin Davis to walk through that process of involving practitioners across the state.
One more slide forward for me, Anna. Thank you. Yeah, so during the production of this report, we met with the Special Education Policy Sprint team several times. The meetings were crucial and really beneficial to us in the development of this. It included folks from a variety of roles in the field, and the group really supported our team in the importance of naming some data gaps that we had, specifically when we think about the level of implementation of effective instructional practices, the quality of Tier 1 first-time instruction, and access to multi-tiered systems of support. We have gaps that prevent us from responding to some of the goals that the report identified. For example, responding to the challenges of fully implementing Act 173 and the lessons learned from implementation efforts to date. We're going to talk about that in a moment as one of our findings. There are some data gaps, and we really tried to identify those and be specific about what we could share with you confidently based on the data and the things that we are not yet prepared to share and need to explore further. Additional themes that were raised through our work with the Sprint team included the variability in district capacity to meet the needs of students with IEPs. The continuum of educational environments vary widely across our state, and we know there's variability that is expected, but we also know that within the variability, there's limited access in some places to highly skilled professionals, variations in terms of teacher preparation gaps, and then a genuine need to have a more robust program evaluation and monitoring protocols to assess the quality and cost of special education delivery across the entire system. This charges beyond the scope of just special education. There's a need for improvement that's present and necessary across the entire system. The Sprint team also stressed the importance of clear communication to the legislature that when we're talking about cost, it has implications. And when we think about the cost of special education, that special education is as expensive as it needs to be in order to make our educational system accessible in Vermont. Special education is about addressing progress in the general education curriculum for students with disabilities through the services, goals, and supports, which ultimately make up what we reference as specially designed instruction. It means the student needs specially designed instruction beyond the scope of what is in general education can offer in order to make progress. And we have to be mindful in the ways in which we understand this data, because students on IEPs have individualized programming based on how they access general education. And therefore, we cannot look to special education as the sole reason for rising costs. We're talking about systems here. We recognize that special education is presumptive on quality first-time instruction and to improve outcomes for all students, which is a need in our state right now. We really must prioritize and support the academic progression for all students, and ultimately that includes understanding what is happening at that layer of education in our state that most students are interacting with. So when we say improve the quality of tier 1 instruction, improving the quality of tier 1 instruction is essential to realizing the full intentions of inclusion. We're saying that because if the environment is not meeting the needs of most students, all students are going to have a hard time accessing it. And students with disabilities are going to be identified as needing specially designed instruction in order to access their general education environments, which results in an increase in students being identified as needing those services. And in order to talk about all of this effectively and actually change outcomes for our entire system, we have to understand the gaps and then understand what's happening at that first layer. This is really, we want to make sure that we're thinking intentionally about going upstream, that some of these findings are downstream effects on students with disabilities and IEPs. Absolutely. We can progress to the next one. So one of our main findings has to do with the increased student need and extraordinary costs. I seem to have put my materials out of order. Thank you. There's several main findings highlighted within the report. Firstly, the increased student need. Overall enrollment has declined, but the number of students with IEPs has increased. Additionally, we have growth in students qualifying for extraordinary expenses, and that indicates greater intensity and complexity of needs. This information, coupled with those rising extraordinary costs, particularly as it relates to tuition and transportation, reflects both an increasing severity of student need and an unknown variability of in-house capacity, staffing, and specialized resources. Extraordinary costs have driven nearly half of the growth in special education spending over 6 years. while only 15% of the expenditures. So despite driving 50% of the growth, these extraordinary costs make up for only 15% of the total amount currently being spent on special education. When you take that at an even more granular level, that growth is concentrated specifically in the areas of tuition and transportation costs for more intensive cases.
So can folks hear me all right in the room?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So as of school year 23-24, there were 16,152 students with individualized education programs, ages 3 through 21 in Vermont. There is an ongoing trend of increasing total number of students with disabilities on IEPs, aged 3 through 21, and an increasing total extraordinary cost, even as overall student enrollment has declined. So you'll see that the red line is showing the percentage of students on IEPs out of the total number of students enrolled, while the blue line is showing that the total pre-K to 12 enrollments. So while total enrollment kind of goes down, the total percentage of students with IEPs in Vermont is increasing between school year 2019-2020 and through 2023-2024. So it's an increase from 17.9% to 19.16%. So in school year,
Representative Woody, did you have a question about the last slide?
About this.
That one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if you have geographic breakdown of this.
geographic in what sort of way? We do have it broken down by specific, by LEAs or SUSDs, but if there's like geographic regions, we would just need to know that makeup.
That would be, that's the breakdown. Thank you.
Representative
So, wait a second, does that show up in a slide here today?
No, that could be a follow-up. That's how the data are organized to be aggregated at this level.
Yeah.
Representative- Sorry, we have one more question.
Actually, two questions.
Okay.
The first is that Act 73 of 173 of 2018 changed the criteria for identifying students with disabilities, and I noticed the changes in the inflection points in this, and I wondered if this is an indication of greater need or a change in practice. In part because I don't believe that Vermont students are twice as likely in some districts to be disabled students on average in the nation. So I wondered if you considered whether it's increasing need or a change in practice.
So actually in the report, there's some additional data and there's a time point for that where you can see the rule changes. So Anna, if you want to take that question, because I know that was an area that you really examined deeply.
Yeah, I think so. There's a slide in a few that you'll see it a little bit clearer. And then if we wanted to look at, we could provide more data specifically for those rule changes because it does impact certain disability categories more than others. So we would just want to provide probably a little bit clearer of a graph to help analyze that.
Okay, if you could remind us when we get to that slide so that we can revisit the question, that'd be great. And then I think there's a second.
Well, my follow-up question was that when Act 173 of 2018 passed, it was the intent of the body was that we would focus on primary first instruction because that is the way we prevent over-identification. Unfortunately, the division or the group that was set up to do that work was ended, the people were dispersed and the money was reallocated. So that work around improving primary first instruction never happened. And I wonder, I wonder, is there an intent in the administration right now to actually do work around improving instruction? Because I can't help but wonder if some of this data is what we're seeing because we failed to do that initial work.
Yeah, so our report was really clear that we've identified major implementation challenges with Act 173. That's a main finding that we're going to go through in the subsequent slides. Also, as part of our strategic plan, there's a very intentional plan and a strategy to support statewide training and support to improve the quality of Tier 1 instruction. So that absolutely is a main finding and is directing our efforts as an agency.
So let's revisit that question at the very end and make sure.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Back to you all. I believe Anna was up.
Thank you. So in school year 24-25, there were 16,354 students in total with IEPs spanning ages 3 through 21 in Vermont. 1,460 of whom were ages 3, 4, and 5-year-olds that were in pre-K. And this graph shows the total number of students on IEPs in Vermont from school year 2019 to school year 2025. So the data shows that for most of the period from 2019 to 2025, the number of students with IEPs remain consistent around 15,500 from school year 20 to school year 2023, with the count rising approximately to 16,000 students in school year 2024. So just to not create more confusion, but the dotted line on the graph does represent a change in measurement methodology. This was because of federal definitions and categories. So before school year 2021 or before school year 21, the data for students on IEPs was divided into 2 age groups, 3 through 5 and 6 through 21. And then beginning in school year 21, the measurement was adjusted to 3 to 5-year-olds not in kindergarten, and then 5-year-olds in kindergarten through ages 21. So this change in methodology partly explains the visual shift in that green line and red line. And after school year 21 measurement change, the way the data is collected remains consistent, so allowing for a clearer view of like these trends. So from school year 2022 forward, the data shows a growth in the number of students with IEPs. This recent increase in total student count is not a general trend across all age groups, but rather is driven by a steady rise in the number of school-age students requiring an IEP. The data shows that the number of preschool age students has remained largely stable, while the number of students ages 6 through 21 has steadily increased. When considering grade level percentage of students with an IEP, that number ranges for K-12 students from 16 to 22% on average. So indicating the rate of students with IEPs persists across grades for school age students with IEPs. And then to that earlier question, the rule changes was in effect for school year 2023, so we could, in a follow-up, provide that change in eligibility with a line, and then possibly also broken down by disability categories, which would help that one of those first questions that popped up. So the chart on the left specifically isolates the data for 3 primary disability categories for students on IEPs: other health impairment, emotional disturbance, and autism. Students with autism as a primary disability category shows an increase of 33 percentage points between school year 2019 and school year 25. Other health impairment has also shown an increase by 26 percentage points between school year 2019 and 2025. And then emotional disturbance has remained relatively stable, but it's kind of pulled out into the table on the right for school year 22-23 to its higher than average prevalence in Vermont compared to a national percentage.
For what is the definition for purposes of this count of emotional disturbance? Is that diagnosed mental illness, or if there's we have families who can't access mental health care, so is that identified by guidance counselors, school nurses?
So emotional disturbance as defined can differ significantly. So yeah, I'm sorry, it's a little hard to hear.
And the question was, how would a student qualify as for a disability of emotional disturbance? What is the criteria?
Yeah, so I probably am not the best person to ask for eligibility. We can follow up with that, and I can speak to the team, and we have folks that focus on evaluation procedures and disabilities categories.
Thanks. Representative Brady, I'm sorry, I didn't say it. No, sorry, I didn't. It might be the same thing where we need some further information, but I was hoping you could explain more other health impairment, what that includes what the person, what the increase seems to be, if there's particulars that are common across the rate of increase, et cetera.
So other health impairment, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Anna.
Other health impairment is like a special education disability category for students that have like chronic or acute health problems that limit their strength, vitality, or alertness and adversely affect their educational performance. If I understood the question correctly.
Back to you.
Okay, so the next couple of slides show changes over time in special education revenues and expenditures. So the first slide here looks at the major special ed revenue sources from 2020 to 2024. It's kind of fine print, but prior to Act 173, we relied on the reimbursement model. So those are the first three columns on the far left. And then we switched to the reimbursement to the special ed census block grant, which is blue and purple columns in the middle. And then we have the second set of data is the special ed main block grant. And then after the census block grant is extraordinary reimbursements. And you'll notice, as mentioned earlier, that there is significant growth in that subcategory over time as a percentage, much higher growth than the other categories. Then we also have IDEAB revenues, EEE revenues, state-placed student reimbursements, and then finally Medicaid IEP reimbursements. Next slide. Then looking on the expenditure side, from fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 24, we have total special ed expenditures for those years, and then percentage growth in each year.
Sorry, if you go to the last slide, I was trying to zoom in. See it. When you call these revenue sources, the revenue sources for districts or revenue sources for the state?
State aid to districts.
State aid to districts.
Yeah.
Thank you. And how does money get into that state aid to, which of across here, how much of that is federal and how much of it is state education fund dollars?
I would have to follow up with that. I couldn't answer that right now.
Okay. Thanks.
Looking at the total expenditures over time, from fiscal year 18 until about fiscal year 21, they were kind of flat, not much significant growth. And some of that, especially fiscal year 20 and 21, was due to COVID. And we weren't transporting kids around. There was limited services available, so there was actually some decreases. But there was exceptional growth in fiscal years 2022, 23, and 24. In that entire time period from fiscal year 18 to 24, the growth was somewhere around 17% in total during that extended period, which is not insignificant, but I would have you notice that that's actually a little bit less than total education spending growth, which had higher growth in that total period. But and then looking specifically at the total extraordinary costs, the percentage increase in that category was significant. And that's where we mentioned earlier that even though it only represents about 15% of the total special ed costs, it represents about 50% of the total increase in special ed costs.
And the expenses are the total aggregated district expenses?
Yeah.
Does it include any of your expenses at AOE?
Only if that money goes through and then the districts spend it.
And so for the district spending, is that only district spending that goes through AOE, or is it district spending that might be coming from other sources as well?
It's from any source.
Okay.
Yeah. Any expenditure that they identify as special ed is included in that.
Representative Holcomb?
Now had several business managers, and special ed people work through the reimbursement forms for extraordinary expenses with me. And what I can't help but notice is that if you serve a child in a district at a lower cost, when you use that reimbursement process, you often end up getting reimbursed less than if you place the district out of the child out of district into say a for-profit setting that may charge 2 times as much just because of the formula and the way it works. So it is often less expensive for the district to place a child in a more expensive, substantially separate setting. I'm wondering if that's related to our over reliance on those settings. But I also know that that is going to increase total cost of the ed fund as we see there in these very high numbers. And I just wondered if that's something that you're looking at as well.
Yeah, so another finding of the report that we'll talk about is really ensuring that we can have a greater continuum of support available within district support. So we'll walk through that in a minute. And we've actually been able to have some examples with different districts that have been able to implement effective programs to fully meet the needs of their students. But yes, that is
I'm sorry, are you looking at the reimbursement?
we did, I'm not specific to your question around the reimbursement process, but we can talk about that when we get to the conversation around how we're delivering those services. Is the question around
I
a
saw
review?
about state placed students.
Yeah, we do have,
Yeah, I didn't see
I think that, I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. Is your question if there needs to be a review of the actual reimbursement formula? That's not part of this discussion. Follow up.
Oh, yeah, mine was very much a follow-up on that question. When we created Act 173, one of the big debates was the level that we reimbursed extraordinary costs, where we've provided an incentive, as Representative Holcomb, I think, was pointing out, to use out-of-placement services because it would be at a much higher reimbursement from the state level. And again, I don't think I heard you say yes or no. That it's
So yeah, so I'm clear on your question. So we did talk about that last spring and really reviewing that formula. And there was an adjustment there that allows for those increased reimbursement rates. I have to go back to our report to see if there was a further analysis from last spring that we can touch on when we get to that section. But yeah, we had those conversations around the incentives around the formula.
Back to you, Anna. Or not? Was it, sorry, it wasn't you, Anna.
It's over to me.
So sorry, come on, confuse the flow. I know you can't really see us.
Got it. Yeah. So this last graph here is now showing the growth in extraordinary costs by disability category. And this illustrates the distribution of extraordinary special education costs in Vermont across different disability categories from fiscal year 2015 through 2025. You'll see the categories of emotional disturbance and autism are resulting in more extraordinary costs to provide services than the other categories. It reveals that the rising overall costs are not spread evenly, but instead heavily concentrated in a few specific categories. The graph highlights the following trends. Autism and emotional disturbance are the primary disability categories that contribute to extraordinary special education costs. The costs associated with those two categories have grown significantly since 2015 and dominate the total extraordinary expenditure. The categories multiple disabilities and other health impairment also show a notable increase in the costs over this period. This could suggest a growing combination of complex needs that require high-cost specialized services. In contrast, costs for other major disability categories, such as specific learning disabilities and speech language impairments, have remained relatively low and stable. This reinforces that the financial pressure on the special education system is not due to a general increase in the number of students with disabilities, but rather a targeted growth for students requiring more intensive special education services. these begin to provide us some insight, right? These last few graphs. The overall growth in extraordinary costs as seen on these graphs, that growth is probably influenced by an increase in intensive special education cases for students with autism, emotional disturbances, and multiple disabilities, and also perhaps a challenge in our current system's ability to meet students' needs locally. This trend,
Sorry.
Just looking at this graph, there seems to be pretty steady growth in most, if not all, of the categories through 19. And then again from 20 onward, and we can all assume what 20 onward growth, what that event was. What's with the drop from 19 to 20 in pretty much every category?
19 to 20, so that was COVID. We mentioned earlier, for example, that there was a significant reduction in transportation costs when most of the
Oh, because that would have
learning
fallen
was
under
happening
FY.
remotely.
Yeah. I was thinking Calwards. Yep.
Yeah, thanks. So this trend is also directly connected to Vermont special education funding system. The state provides an excess cost grant to reimburse districts for the extraordinary cost of students with high needs. And if there are questions about that, we have some fiscal representatives that are better positioned to field those questions than myself. But in general, the data suggests that this funding mechanism is being used more frequently and for a growing number of students in those specific categories. We were going to pause here if there were any questions, but you all have been doing a wonderful job of sprinkling those in, so I can keep.
And if it would be easier for us to save our questions until natural pause points, we're very capable of that.
It's been working very well for us, I think.
We're very capable of enforcing that.
I trust you are. Okay, so Anna, could you move forward just one slide for me? Thank you. All right, so we're going to shift gears into talking about the gaps in service delivery, which was another main finding of ours. And this is notable when we consider the data around educational environments. Vermont serves students in either a highly inclusive classroom setting, which means that 80% or more of the day is spent in a classroom. 80% or more of the day when we're thinking about ed environments is spent in the general education setting or in separate schools. So kind of a bifurcated process here, which is shown on the separate line item when looking at the data. In the report, this pattern is broken down by disability category, and there's a ton of work needed here to really understand the complexity of this finding. However, there are patterns in terms of it could be creating cost implications, and we're highlighting some service delivery gaps here. It also really showcases the continued challenges with general education and special education practices and the alignment of those practices. So a heavy reliance on paraeducators to access general education for those students who are spending their time in the general education setting at more than 80% of their time. And then a limited shared ownership of outcomes for students with IEPs.
These are the federal categories of educational environments. The first setting, served inside the regular classroom 80% or more of the day, is considered the least restrictive environment, as the most inclusive setting. And as you go down the list of potential settings, they get more restrictive: 40 to 79% of the day, less than 40% of the day, separate schools, residential facilities. And then there are some educational environments not shown here, which include correctional facilities, hospital or homebound placements. So as you look at the data, you'll notice that a large percentage of our students are served in the least restrictive setting. There has always been a focus on inclusion in Vermont, and in most cases, our students on IEPs are served in their regular setting 80% or more of the day, and that's at 82.32%, which represents more than 12,000 students. And then looking at the percentage of students served in the regular classroom, 40 to 79% has decreased since school year 22 to school year 25. Similarly, students served inside the regular class less than 40% of the day has also decreased in school year 21, while students that are served in separate schools has increased since school year 21. So looking at educational environments by similar sized states of students on IEPs ages 5 through 21, the most recent national data for comparison is school year 23. And for that year, Vermont had the third highest percentage in the nation of students being served in separate schools. When compared to these states, Vermont surpasses these states and the national average for the percentage of students included in the regular class 80% or more of the day. And as you look at other educational environments, you'll notice a similar trend. 40 to 79% of the day, our percentage is very low comparatively. And then again, the higher percentage of students in separate schools at 5.27%, which is more than double the national average of 2.36%.
So we're going to break these data down a little bit more. And now we're looking at these data specifically with the disability category of autism. And those percentages are representing that number of total students with a primary disability category of autism. So Vermont leads in this table at 63% for including students with autism in regular classrooms, regular education classrooms, for 80% or more of the day, which is substantially higher than the peer states. In this comparison, that does not indicate that students are placed in less restrictive settings at a higher frequency than the states in this comparison, though. Conversely, Vermont has a notably lower percentage of students with autism served inside of a regular classroom, between 40 to 79% of their time of their day, at 15%. And as you move down to separate schools, you notice that there's a much higher percent of students with autism placed in separate schools at 9%. This figure is quite a bit higher than Wyoming and North Dakota, and also surpasses the national average of 5.81%. This pattern suggests that when full inclusion, so 80% in the regular education classes, if that isn't the chosen path for a student with autism in Vermont, the alternative often tends to be a separate school setting rather than a less restrictive option like a regular classroom for just a portion of their day.
Could you describe a little bit what a less restrictive setting would look like other than putting a child into a separate school? So I'm trying to understand what that middle delivery system looks like, and how that might vary across different types of districts, because some districts have access to different resources than other districts. So for example, designated agencies or other folks that help meet the needs. So what would it look like for a child who's inside the regular classroom from like 40 to 79% of the things? What would they do in the other part?
So one model that's not infrequent is some type of resource room, where the students are spending a portion of their day in a setting with special educators who can support them in that way. And then they are looking at the needs of the child to identify the parts of the day where it makes sense to include them. So perhaps they can join their peers in music and PE courses and those kinds of things, but they need the additional support and pull out for their literacy instruction, just as one example. So I would say that's probably the most common model that I've seen, is that there's some kind of pull out space where they're getting some of their instruction in that setting. And then there's other parts of the day where they identify, based on the needs of the child, how they can be included with their peers in the general education setting.
So you've identified that as a gap, our system versus other states, perhaps. What do you think is driving that gap in part of the instruction?
Yeah, I don't know that we're able to say quite yet. That is an area of further inquiry, and it's a reason that we've identified this finding as a critical one in our analysis here. I mean, that's going to vary widely across the state, and it certainly is an area that we need to get a little bit more deeper of an understanding of, and I wouldn't want us to conjecture prematurely. Yeah.
I would say qualitatively, we've been having these conversations with districts that are developing their programming within house to evaluate the advantages of providing those services, and also what it takes to be able to actually pull those together, what resources and expertise needs to be brought to bear in order to deliver those specialized programs in district. And we definitely see that scale impacts of a district's ability to do that. And certainly some of the case examples that we've identified larger districts are able to provide more comprehensive continuums of support for their students, and even offering, specialized schools and programs within larger districts. So it's an area that we're focused on. So within the therapeutic school setting, there is a lot of statutory requirements in terms of actually reporting data and oversight of those programs. There's not the same type of visibility that the agency has for those specialized programs that are developed within district. And so what we've talked about with a lot of practitioners across the state is there's a value in being able to have greater visibility to those programs, how they're organized, so that we can actually learn from them and scale those effective practices across the state of Vermont. We've had very willing partners among our special educators in districts in the state who are really helping to surface some of those promising practices, but it is not currently required for the agency to have any role in overseeing that or collecting data. In this report, we're not suggesting that, but we are suggesting we need to learn more about that. So we have greater visibility to the positive impacts that can be established when these in-district supports are available, and what, to your question, is required in order to make those happen. And so far, in some of the preliminary review that we have done, there's definitely impacts of scale and funding to be able to do that, and level of specialization. And so that's why it's really an area that we're going to be focusing further, because we know, given that there's increased acuity of needs of students across the state, that there's extra demand for our educators to have that specialized training and expertise. Many of our districts, because they challenge to hire for those roles, are having to contract that out at significantly higher cost. So all that feeds into this broader conversation. Hopefully that gave you more context.
Representative Brady?
So as you've looked at some of the promising practices in this qualitative data, is it happening in larger districts or larger schools? I don't know if you could maybe give some specific examples of where you're seeing some of this. And I wonder if you have examples of small schools in large districts that are doing it, or if we're talking about larger districts that also have larger schools.
There are certainly different models that we're reviewing. Certainly larger districts have been more of a focus of how we're looking at that in terms of pooling resources. We've also approved the first BOCES in the southern part of the state and are reviewing that implementation model. We have started these qualitative convenings with a number of districts that are offering programs. And I think what we found was in most districts that we reached out to, they said, oh yeah, we have a specialized program. Okay, share more about it. There just wasn't that visibility. And so we weren't able to pull this into the report, but those conversations are ongoing. And so we've been able to collect program descriptions from across the state and are still in the process of really evaluating that to fully answer your question around where we see exemplars, not just because of size of districts, but different configurations of schools. I don't think we're far enough along at this point in our review to give you specifics, but we are seeing that this is kind of emergent and is happening in districts, and we're seeing that there's different abilities to deliver on those goals because of some of the challenges around scale and funding.
Yeah, Representative Holcomb, then we're gonna
I'm really glad you're hearing from those, because I know when I emailed the agency a year ago, they couldn't tell me where those district-based programs were, so I appreciate that you're looking for them now.
Yes.
I know in my area, the Hartford area, collaborative has been around for decades.
Yes.
One of
They've been part of our focus groups.
one of the challenges, I'm going to go back to the reimbursement rules, but also the way we handle, various points, the way we handle test scores, the way we handle reimbursement. We actually make it harder for those to be done within districts. But I wonder if you see, and maybe you'll get to this, but the BOCES or regional shared services as a way to sidestep some of those current challenges and create that scale where it's needed, but also in a way that doesn't punish those districts who do step up and hope some of those programs.
Yeah, so we've been really consistent that we see a role for shared service delivery in particular areas of education delivery, inclusive of special education. The question is, where can you get to scale with larger districts? and then what type of specialization is still needed that we would need to pool resources across the state, either statewide service delivery or regional. And so those are things we've been consistent in saying that it's an area of focus, and we provided some recommendations in a subsequent report around how to structure those regional service deliveries. There's a lot of different ways to deliver them. And I know many of you in the room are really well versed in those different models. I mean, I think part of our recommendation as we look at the BOCES law was passed before we were contemplating larger scale education transformation. And I think recognizing that we know that this is a need, there's different ways that we can structure those models in order to ensure that they are fully aligned with the objectives and the needs of the state, and also resourced appropriately, so that we're not creating additional duplicative work district by district by district across the state to achieving the benefits of some regional service delivery, and then contemplating what can actually be delivered through larger districts with central offices that are more robust versus what still needs to be, would have some demands for additional regional service delivery. And special education is an area consistently that we've said we'd want to look at to evaluate statewide.
We're gonna move to clarifying questions only, and then
Okay.
big picture questions at natural breaks.
Okay.
So this slide shows you the educational environments for students with a disability category of emotional disturbance. Before we dig into this table, I want to note that this disability category is defined differently from state to state and has different eligibility criteria from state to state. So this comparison is not linear, since there are many variables that might cause variation across the states. The table does show a distinct pattern for students identified with emotional disturbance, with Vermont's data again standing out from its peers and the national average. Again, similar to the chart on the previous slide with the disability category of autism, Vermont serves a high percentage of students with emotional disturbance in regular ed classrooms for 80% or more of the day, coming in at 62%, which is higher than the national average, but less than our peer states. As you move down the table again, Vermont shows a very low percentage of students with emotional disturbance in regular classrooms for 40 to 79% of the day at 5%, and for less than 40% of the day at 7%. Both of those figures are well below the national average and other states in the table, which again might indicate that these intermediate placement options are not frequently used in Vermont for students with emotional disturbances. The most significant finding is Vermont's extremely high rate of placing students with emotional disturbance in separate schools at almost 20%. This figure is nearly double the national average, and it's drastically higher than both Wyoming and North Dakota. The data for students with emotional disturbance sort of reinforces that all or nothing pattern that we were seeing with the data on students with autism. Vermont places a higher proportion of students in a fully inclusive setting, the 80% or more, compared to the national average. However, for the students who are not placed in that setting, Vermont's educational system appears to be heavily favoring separate school placements, almost to the exclusion of other options within local schools. The very low percentages in the 40 to 79% and less than 40% categories suggests a lack of a robust continuum of in-district support services that could serve as alternatives to separate schools. Could be due to a variety of factors. I know we've already started to get into this a little bit, but such as the severity of the students' needs, a lack of specialized resources, a lack of specialized staffing in the local schools, or a systemic preference for separate school environments for this particular population. The complexities that we've outlined on these slides should be evaluated with caution. The agency has identified that while many districts have organized specialized settings and intentional clusters of services to provide support for students with specific disability categories, it's not currently collected data, as the secretary was speaking to, in such a way that the agency staff can evaluate with confidence the quality or structure of the services. This is an area that we are pursuing further inquiry that should include both qualitative analysis and comparative quantitative analysis on student outcomes in a variety of those service models.
Oh, sorry, Representative Bodie.
Bring this water bottle next time.
Yes.
But in particular for the educational environments for students with emotional disturbance, do you look at the classrooms that these children are in to see what the, how students overall are performing, if there are students in that classroom with severe emotional disturbances in that classroom? And do you consider a classroom the least restrictive environment for a student with emotional disturbances?
When determining the least restrictive environment, obviously we're wanting to be as inclusive as possible, but we're considering the needs of the child. It may not be appropriate for them to be in a general education setting to have their needs met at all portions of the day. And so it's really about looking very closely at that individual child's needs and always erring on the side of trying to be as inclusive of a setting as possible, but making sure that that is actually appropriately meeting their needs. The second
Is
question.
that a state or federal, remind me, please, I looked at this in a while, a state or federal requirement for least
Least restrictive environment is federal. Is federal.
do you have data about how the children in the classroom are doing?
You're asking about the student with the disability or their peers that are not, everybody? Yeah.
I think if you could talk about just the overall trends we're seeing in performance and then the need to ensure that the student.
I think that's moving beyond clarifying questions.
All right,
We can,
And I just want to make sure that we have time to
okay.
get into all
I
of it.
think we can have a fuller conversation around, I think your question really is how we're making sure that every student is getting the educational quality experience through our system and that the right supports are in place in the classroom to achieve that. I think that's your question. Yeah, and we can have a fuller conversation around some of the strategies we have in place to provide some additional training around those evidence-based practices and also a more coherent monitoring and support framework that will allow us to be better positioned to respond to that in future planning. Okay, thanks.
She has a wonderful connection to the next slide.
Yes.
So thank you for the segue. So the next main finding has to do with the role of high quality in a first time instruction, right? And so that is going to be directly connected to outcomes for all students. So another main finding is something that we've alluded to a number of times at this point. We must recognize the role of high quality instruction. Declining performance is present for all types of learners in the state currently. Plus, there are ongoing persistent achievement gaps for students with IEPs. And that speaks to a need for stronger implementation of best practices and first instruction in evaluation of the implementation of Act 173 and of the accessibility of environments to all students. We just shared one, we have higher rates of separate placements for students with significant needs compared to other states, and perhaps the continuum of supports is missing in many schools and districts. We need to support schools in both building less restrictive classroom environments and placements that are aligned with individual needs. And we need to strengthen the role of that first time high quality instruction. Yes. That's fine. I might claim this water.
Yes, go ahead.
Out of the three of us. Okay, so this report and the subsequent special education strategic plan report call for an evaluation of Act 173. It's a critical task, and Act 173 was not special education legislation. We need to get clear on that foundation. Act 173 was the right legislation, and it tackles many of the issues that we're talking about now. However, the accountability methods at the Agency of Education that are currently in place do not yet offer visibility into the implementation of Act 173. We don't really know all of the ways in which evidence-based practices are being implemented, both in general ed classrooms and special education settings. The consistency of access to intervention supports is another unknown. We're not sure yet how the clusters of services function across schools and districts. And again, bigger than just special education, bigger than just students with IEPs, and their ability to access special education, this is really about all students who struggle, understanding how schools are approaching their multi-tiered systems of support design and how that impacts service delivery for all the types of plans that could be employed for any student who struggles. The crucial next step for us in an area of inquiry in this process, and much of that work is not just from within the special education division, but more broadly within the academics area that I lead. And then lastly, just want to acknowledge, I know we looked at the dates a couple of times here, that this act did pass in 2018. And so there was an interruption in implementation due to the pandemic.
As we conclude the findings from this report, we do want to lift up a note of caution as the legislature is considering different cost containment considerations. It is important to keep in mind the federal rules governing our IDEA. So we're not going to get into too much detail, although I am going to highlight a couple of specifics around maintenance of fiscal support and maintenance of effort. So these are dual accountability methods that protect funding for students with disabilities, and just something that the legislature should and must consider as we consider any cost containment strategies. At the state level, there is maintenance of fiscal support. At the local level, it is maintenance of effort. And these provisions require that we maintain funds for special education spending. It is that accountability mechanism that governs the use of IDEA funds. I think it is important to note as we Act 73 contemplates a funding change to understand the impact of that funding change on our ability as a state to maintain fiscal support and the implications on districts to maintain for MOE. You will recall that the original, I know there was some question about this in some prior testimony, so we want to give a little context to the time frame of how the funding system has evolved into Act 73. The original proposal from the governor did recommend that we maintain the census block funding precisely because we have some questions and concerns around the impact on maintenance of fiscal support and maintenance of effort. And recognizing too that census block funding has not fully been implemented in terms of rolling out the financial system. Additionally, we have had a lot of conversations already with U.S. Department of Education and OSEP specifically around the state's intention to move towards a transformed state, which will be more efficient and effective at delivering high quality education services, inclusive of special ed, to really think through the implications of any funding change on our ability to achieve MFS and MOE into the future. As we analyzed the funding proposal, one of the goals within this report was for the agency to put forward a review of those conditions that need to be in place in order to move towards the weighted funding proposal that is included in Act 73. We have commissioned a separate study to evaluate that, and that study will be available to you this legislative session, which is looking at the disadvantages and advantages of moving towards a new weighted system for special education, along with considering the implications on MFS and MOE. So that will be a resource to you in the coming months to support decision-making, and I know also to support the Joint Fiscal Office as they finalize the funding strategy.
When? I mean, this session, like, April, this session is not useful, so I'm just wondering when.
Well, it does align with the role of the Joint Fiscal Office study. So hopefully they're beginning to do that work this month. So I think we do have April as our timeline, but I will go back and look at the scope of work to finalize the date for that. But that's precisely the reason that we didn't make recommendations in the report that we submitted to you in the summer, because we recognize that this has tremendous implications on MFS and MOE, and it is really critical that we do our review and due diligence to bring forward to you any potential ramifications of those decisions. So just wanted to note that we recognized that is a request that you've made of us. We've also recognized that there's some additional expertise needed to evaluate that. And then I want to highlight that the reason we are taking that so seriously on the next slide, this does have, we are required to maintain this. If the state or districts are out of compliance, there is a 1-to-1 penalty in terms of dollar amount. So it does have a very significant fiscal impact. I do want to note that there are exceptions for when you're reducing the amount of spending for students with disabilities. And that's if there's one high-cost staff departure. If there's an extraordinary student that has an extraordinary qualifies for extraordinary expenses and exits the system either through graduation or moving to another district that would qualify. The overall reduction in census, reduction in the child count of students with an IEP, and then long-term purchases. So the Vermont LEAs have used the exceptions 1 through 3 in order to justify that reduction in MOE. So I just wanted to highlight that and just stress this as a note of caution. I know you were joined by special education directors or some committees earlier this week, and this came forward as a question, and wanted just to share that we are very well aware of this and are being really methodical and thoughtful around bringing recommendations forward and partnering with the Joint Fiscal Office to ensure we have a full understanding of what any change in the funding system and how it would impact our ability to achieve MFS MOE.
Before you transition to the next report, we also had the Council of Special Education Administrators scheduled for this time slot. Our committee assistant told me it was a bad idea and too much of a time crunch and she listened to her. So I'm curious, with like folks in the room, better to have, should we transition to the Council of Special Education Administrators and then have AOE come back? Okay, would that be okay for all of you to come back and do the second half of your presentation? Okay.
Could I make a suggestion? I'm sorry to jump in. I'm Erin McGuire.
Love that for you.
I think that having the agency finish this presentation and for us to be here with you all for it, and then to be able to respond in totality. I've been taking several notes and have lots of thoughts to share, and am interested in hearing the rest of it. We would be happy to schedule a time to return to you all, as opposed to having the agency be bifurcated in their presentation. Certainly, though, happy to do whatever it is that the committees feel is most appropriate.
We're going to follow your lead, Erin. Thank you so much for jumping in. Back to you. No interruptions.
Thank you. And thank you, Erin. And Erin's been a part of our steering committee, among others. And I just want to emphasize, this report came about because of the collaboration that we have had with practitioners across the state. And what you're seeing here is real clarity around where we feel like we have gaps. And our strategic plan is designed to address those gaps. And so it was really important for us to have those conversations and producing this report so that we were really honest about where the challenges are in Vermont and clear around the role of the Agency of Education, role of the districts, and how we can work together to overcome many of the challenges and the barriers that we've identified. Another slide. Oh, so throughout this process, we have looked at our organization and how we can best deliver on the education priorities of the field. I think all of the committees are aware that the Agency of Education completed a reorganization, and that was intentionally designed to elevate our areas of focus where they are needed most, and to reorganize our teams and expertise in a way that can be responsive to the field and supporting us in achieving our collective goals. And so within the special education division, there were some really substantive changes that occurred through our reorganization. Mainly, special education has been elevated now within the Agency of Education. It previously was a team that was buried within another division. And so was not part of the kind of decision-making that happened, at the agency-wide executive level. So a couple changes that I will note. We created a new academics area, and with that was the addition of the chief academic officer. Dr. Aaron Davis has taken the leadership of that role. We also have added a deputy chief of academics. The deputy chief of academics will be overseeing special education and curriculum instruction. That is with intention, because what you're hearing from us in the presentation is that in order to enhance our special education delivery, we need to enhance the quality of Tier 1 general instruction for all students. And that's why the organizational structure is reflective of that. The deputy chief of academics and the chief academic officer both sit on my executive cabinet. And then we have elevated the state director of special education role to be a division director of special education, which sits on my extended cabinet. We, through the appropriation from the General Assembly, we added another role that is supporting with the management of our strategic plan. We are in the final interview process to bring on that role. We've also made some shifts to ensure that those folks in the agency that were really dedicated to special education for our younger students, our for school age students, are now part of the team, so that we're creating that alignment across how we provide support and monitoring for special education. Additionally, outside of the special education team, we created roles to support our oversight and training and financial management of IDEA funds and all special ed revenue resources. So that includes the addition on our finance team of a special education finance director. Additionally, we have created a grants management division with an emphasis on overseeing IDEA funds and providing that level of support. So want to emphasize that our reorganization efforts were very mindful of the needs that we have to strengthen our focus at the Agency of Special Education, or our agency-wide focus on special education, and is intentional about breaking down silos that had been pretty persistent at the agency and contributing to some of the challenges that we have noted. So wanted to just emphasize, many of you know about our reorganization, but wanted to make sure you understood the intentional design and focus relative to increasing special education leadership and expertise. Within our strategic,
Madam Secretary, you said that you were in the final interview stages for which role was that again?
The strategic plan coordinator, it's an education program manager
Okay.
for the special education team.
And the other ones you mentioned, are they all filled at this point?
The chief academic officer position is filled. The deputy chief academic position is, I think, posted
this week.
posted this week. So we're really thrilled about that. Also, the special education division director role is posted now, and we are recruiting. So for those of you who are watching, who are interested in making a positive impact on special education delivery in the state of Vermont, please, I encourage you to apply and be part of our team of supporting our goals of improving special education delivery for all students across the state of Vermont. Thanks for letting me.
Or by
Okay. We have a lot of details in the remainder of this report around our special education strategic plan. I do recognize that we are short on time. So if we could progress to the next slide and have a site to hear where we are. Oh, I'm in the right place? Okay. So the Act 73, in addition to requiring a report, required us to develop a strategic plan to enhance special education delivery, wanting to ensure that we had very clear measures and goals of how we were going to make that improvement, with an emphasis on implementation. This requirement coincided with the Agency of Education being engaged in a comprehensive strategic planning process that started with an environmental scan, where we've gone all across the state for a listen and learn tour, We've done an intensive data analysis to really evaluate some of the gaps and the opportunities for improvement. And so it was important as we took on this requirement that we embedded our focus on special education within the agency-wide strategic plan. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're structuring that to ensure clarity on roles and responsibilities with an emphasis on implementation and results-based accountability. This work continues to involve both practitioners and families across Vermont. So if we go to the next slide, I'll share with you the inputs that we received into our strategic planning process. We did partner with our special education advisory panel, the SEEP, in really reviewing the first part of all of this work. Started with looking at the report. We need to ground all of our planning around the realities of our current state. And that was the first part of this work, to make sure that the strategies that are going to be implemented are really going to move us into the right direction. So you can see that we had several meetings with the special education advisory panel. We also took into account the work that the SEEP did in producing the unmet needs document. That was another important resource for us in evaluating the current state that is reflected also in our report, where there's clear areas of alignment. We continue on a monthly basis to work with the SEEP and giving updates on where we are in the planning and collecting input. Additionally, we established the steering committee. As Erin was describing earlier in her presentation, that started as a policy sprint team. So we actually organized a policy sprint team last session to try to understand the impact on changes in Act 73 on special education. Because that wasn't as much of a focus in terms of the kind of policy making last session, that team really didn't start working until after Act 73 was passed. And then they've transitioned into being our steering committee, which will continue to support our efforts. The composition of that steering committee has actually evolved. There's additional practitioners across the state that will be joining our efforts to continue to evaluate and provide input on our planning. But the steering committee was very instrumental also in looking at data and giving us really a understanding of what are some true challenges on the ground when you're thinking about implementing some of these best practices, and what are some of the ways in which the agency has been helpful, what are some of the ways in which the agency could improve upon the support. And so we really took that to heart as we developed the strategic plan. When we look at the way we organize the approach for strategic planning, it did start kind of look at kind of 4 buckets of work that we engaged in. The first on that, if you don't mind, Anna, go to the next slide, was starting with the environmental scan, as I've mentioned. The report that we submitted was a really critical input to that. And so we took that work very seriously because we knew it would guide everything else that we did from there. Then we established the strategic framework for the agency-wide strategic plan. We hosted our first statewide planning retreat in November, which was attended by over 300 educators and partners, agency staff. That also was a time frame for us to establish a regular cadence where every year we will come together to review where our progress is. And within the strategic framework, those are organized around the 5 pillars, which we'll walk through momentarily. Those 5 pillars really acknowledge Vermont's emphasis on a whole child approach and ensuring that we are evaluating quality of the entire system. And special education is infused throughout the strategic plan, which is intentional. The next phase is looking at implementation planning and then progress monitoring. So I'm going to kind of flip to share where we are with the report that we sent you is really looking at the environmental scan. So taking the report that we've walked through of those major findings and outlining how special education is infused within this strategic plan framework.
Are there dates attached to the?
I can add those.
That would be great. Sure.
So you can absolutely do that. I would say the strategic framework formally launched in November, just to give you a point of context, because that's when we rolled it out through our strategic planning retreat. And then now we're at the next slide, we're getting into the implementation planning. So we have stood up steering committees. The special education group was the first to really start this work. There were great important lessons learned from that in order for us to best facilitate the steering committees moving forward. The role of the steering committees now is to look at the goals that we have set within each of these pillars and establish measurable targets, along with evaluating if there need to be some revisions, refinements to those set of goals that have been set forth. Additionally, within this work, we're looking at how can we best promote statewide improvement in these areas. And so the steering committees will be an important reference point as we're developing those action plans to make sure that the work that we're setting forth to do is actually going to add value and address the main areas of focus. And then progress monitoring. So we're really clear that we do not want the strategic plan to be something that goes on the shelf. That can often happen. You spend a lot of time, there's a lot of community input and actually developing the plan, and then it goes on the shelf and you're not adjusting it. We're really looking for this to be a working document. And so the steering committees will support us with progress monitoring. So that statewide planning retreat that we had in November, we'll have again next November, making that an annual event. And so while the first one really focused on establishing the framework and the goals, then the next planning retreat is really helping us to evaluate our progress toward those goals so that we can be honest about the advancement we're making, along with if we're not seeing the progress we would like to, so that we actually have that time to make mid-course corrections. Our strategic plan is definitely aligned with a broader vision statement. And so the vision that we've been articulating is for Vermont to be the best education system in the country, and doing that in a way that's really consistent with Vermont's values. And we've operationalized that in terms of giving all students roots and wings. If you'll go to the next slide, and I appreciate it. One of the things we heard from the steering committee that was really important was that our students with IEPs feel like they belong in the classroom, and that's really important. We're talking about roots, is developing that sense of belonging. And one thing that they also emphasize, it's not just a Vermont value, but research shows how important that is for students to thrive academically. And then wings, making sure that every student with an IEP gets the services that they need to thrive and to reach their full potential.
Given the time crunch, I wonder if you could jump to the special education division plan slide.
Sure. So if we can, I'll just kind of show you as you look through this. These are the pillars. This is how we've organized our goal areas. I'll just orient you to the first slide, and then we'll pass through. But within each of these goal areas, we've identified these key performance indicators where we're going to set measurable targets. And so just for your benefit, when you go back through that, you'll see how we've intentionally connected these goals to special education is being infused throughout the plan.
I appreciate that.
No, that's okay. That's fine. The only other piece I would add before the division plan, if you could progress to the funnel slide, Anna, I'd appreciate it, is we're creating that strategic alignment, right? So what we've walked through is agency-wide strategic plan. Each of our divisions is now in the process of doing division planning. Our special education team was the first out of the gate to do that. So commend them for being the leaders in this area. And the intention here is to make sure that we are very clear about how our teams are operationalizing the implementation of these major strategies to drive forward the goals. And an element of that you see reflected in the report is identifying where they also need to collaborate with other divisions, because we are looking to create synergy, not create additional silos. And so as we start to publish these division plans, you'll see that there's clear points of connection that allows us then to cascade all the way down to the district, school improvement plans, and to student IEPs. So moving into the special education division plan, I will just, in the interest of time, very high level identify the key areas of focus, and will allow our team to expand around the detail that is behind that. So within the division plan for special education, we are reestablishing a strong cyclical monitoring approach. We are addressing gaps in service delivery. Part of that is actually doing some further evaluation district by district around how those programs are being organized. Because as we've noted, we don't have visibility right now to the programs and their successes, and we need to know that so we can help to scale those practices. We also are seeking to improve accessibility and caregiver involvement, and have an integrated focus on improving quality throughout our system. And so hopefully you're carrying that as a major takeaway. Everything we're doing within special education is also contextualized within our broader efforts to elevate educational opportunities for all students in every classroom across Vermont. The agency-wide planning has really given us that structure. And in addition, the division plan work is informed by all of the input that we are receiving from our practitioners who are involved in the steering committees, some of which are actually partnering with us on the training that I'm going to share with you in a moment. We are really endeavoring to do this work in a very collaborative way. So some of the major initiatives that have already rolled out, and I want to emphasize this, we're developing a long-range strategic plan. The agency hasn't had a strategic plan for some time. It's really critical, but we know that there are immediate needs now. So we have already launched accelerated initiatives, and we are underway with actually getting into the implementation to support the work now. Within the area of special education, a major initiative is focusing on the implementation of Act 173. That is a major finding that we heard from our report. As Dr. Davis indicated, we recognize that those best practices codified in Act 173 are the right best practices. The challenge has been the fidelity of implementation and also visibility to those practices being implemented and with high quality. So we are developing a playbook, which will also have an accompanying toolkit to guide and monitor strong implementation. We have heard really consistently, guidance documents are not enough. So I want to be really clear on that. This is a structure in which will also be supported by a coherent monitoring toolkit and framework so that we have strong accountability measures. You heard in our report that we often lack data in this area, and this is a course correction in overcoming that. We also, within this scope of work, will be offering boot camp training as early as this spring on effective system support for those students who struggle. And then into the summer and the fall timeframe, we will be hosting regional convenings and coaching to provide differentiated support for the use of this playbook and the toolkit. That will also, beyond regional planning, where we're coming together as a professional learning community, will involve one-on-one coaching for district systems. Additionally, we, as I mentioned, will be furnishing a report for you with some additional considerations around the funding being contemplated with Act 173. That's really focusing on the conditions that are needed to be in place in our system, disadvantages, advantages, and also literature review around how other states have moved forward with a weighted model and the lessons learned that we can build upon. You've heard me talk a lot already about our reorganization being a key element of this strategy. We have really done an emphasis on integrating program and finance. You can see that today too, just within our team members that are here today. But in addition to restructuring, there's new processes that we're building in to ensure that we're having that level of collaboration, that we're doing the transfer of knowledge that is needed to have a full understanding of how we best support our system with special education delivery. We also, you're hearing a lot about a movement away from guidance to focusing more on statewide training and professional learning. This is already underway. We've expanded professional learning on inclusive practices. These trainings, these are statewide training sessions. There's a series of them that have already kicked off, and they are involving both our educators in the field along with our experts at the agency so that we're all learning together and understanding those best practices of how we can move forward. Read Vermont is an initiative that we launched last year to support the implementation of Act 139 and ensuring that our promoting statewide literacy outcomes. Our special education team is very involved in this effort. Again, making sure everything that we're doing is focusing on all students, and that includes understanding the unique needs of students with IEPs. You will note that there's a request coming forward to you through the governor's recommended budget to be able to revert funding to appropriate to this purpose of supporting Read Vermont. So just want to note that is how those dollars would be supporting with job embedded coaching for principals, curriculum directors, and educators around the science of reading. We talk a lot about our holistic education. That is true as we're designing our approach for our special education strategic plan. We know that there's other factors that impact students' abilities to learn. One of them is getting to school, being in the classroom. We have a challenge with chronic absenteeism. This is a national issue that many states are facing and has really been exacerbated since the pandemic. So we have an everyday counts campaign that has been launched. We've also introduced some statutory changes for chronic absenteeism to ensure that there's consistency and how that's implemented across the state, clarity of practices. We've partnered with the health community across Vermont, including UVM. We've hosted a large-scale conference to really provide training and learning around those best practices to reduce chronic absenteeism. We have great examples across our state of districts that are doing this effectively and part of the design of this effort. And graduation requirements. This was another element of Act 73 focused on elevating academic quality. The Agency of Education submitted our recommendations for statewide graduation requirements at the end of the calendar year. That is now with the State Board of Education to review and make determinations around. Within this work, we've been really clear about having one diploma and being consistent with that practice that Vermont has had for a long time. And we've stood up a working group around accessibility for those students with IEPs, and that work is already underway. We have, I think they met this week, correct? Yeah. Kicked off this week just to make sure that we're being really intentional around the accessibility supports needed for our students with disabilities to attain a Vermont high school diploma.
You have 1 minute left. Thank you. That's really helpful. So we'll hear from the Special Education Council maybe next week, and we'll talk to House Ed about if it makes sense to do that jointly or separately. Hallway just got really loud. And thank you all. I think we all have a lot of follow-up questions, and we'll figure out the best way to have everyone back wherever they need to be to get those answered.
The team that you'll hear next will help us to sort through some of those questions too on our steering committee.
Thanks so much.
So thank you all. Thank you all for being online. Sorry to take your time.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Okay, see you soon.